The night Sarah Reeves lost the shelter bed that should have kept her and her 3 daughters safe, the cold felt sharper than any winter she had lived through. She stood outside the social services building with the triplets clinging to her sides, their thin thrift store jackets no match for the brutal November wind. The city hummed around them, distant traffic, a bus groaning down the street, a street lamp flickering like it was tired too. But Sarah felt strangely still inside, like her entire life had reached a pause she didn't know how to unfreeze. She had worked double shifts, survived on dollar menu leftovers, memorized every soup kitchen timetable within 10 miles, and still somehow ended up here, choosing between wandering all night or praying the girls could sleep unnoticed in a restaurant booth. When Sophie whispered that she was hungry and Emma tried to hide a wheeze from the cold air scraping her lungs, something inside Sarah cracked, not defeated, but pushed to the edge of desperation. That was when the stranger appeared, a woman wrapped in a coat far too expensive for this neighborhood, her eyes old enough to remember everything. She didn't ask questions. She just spoke Sarah's mother's name as if it still belonged to the living, opening a door to a past Sarah barely knew and a future she couldn't yet imagine. And with a single envelope, she shifted the ground beneath Sarah's trembling feet forever. The envelope felt heavier than paper should as Sarah opened it on the bus stop bench, her daughters huddled close for warmth. Inside was a letter written in shaky, determined handwriting, one that carried decades of regret. The woman's name was Dorothy, a forgotten relative who had been searching for Sarah for 6 months. She explained that when Sarah's mother died, she had failed to step forward, too entangled in her own grief, too afraid, too late. What she offered now felt almost unreal. The Hartman Brewery, a century-old building abandoned and condemned, once owned by Sarah's ancestors. It wasn't a home, Dorothy warned. The structure was unsafe, the city wanted to demolish it, and it had survived 2 major floods. But it was paid for, its taxes current, and it was hers if she wanted it. Sarah stared at the key, a thick iron thing that looked like it belonged in an old movie, and felt a pull she didn't understand. She'd spent years borrowing spaces, counting hours, surviving on grace and exhaustion. To hold a key, any key, to something that was legally hers, felt like touching sunlight after years underground. When the taxi dropped them at the edge of the industrial district, the brewery towered over them like a forgotten giant. Broken windows, rusted metal, bricks stained by time and river water. But on its stone archway, barely visible through decades of grime, her family name waited for her like a whispered invitation. Hartman Brewery, 1889. Inside, darkness swallowed their footsteps. Sarah used the last flicker of her dying phone to guide them through the cavernous lobby where shattered barrels, rusted machinery, and forgotten staircases created ghostly silhouettes. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, old yeast, and history long abandoned. Every sound echoed, her daughters breathing, the drip of water from pipes overhead, the groan of old beams remembering their purpose. They found an office on the 2nd floor with a door that still locked and windows that weren't completely shattered. It wasn't safe, not really, but it was theirs for the night. As the girls finally slept beneath their single blanket, Sarah sat awake under the dim glow of a street lamp seeping through dirty glass. She thought about the letter, about ancestors she'd never known, about the weight of a building no one wanted. But exhaustion eventually claimed her. At dawn, the girls explored the dusty office, whispering at a faded mural that showed the brewery in its prime. Workers hauling barrels, trucks lined up, chimneys smoking, and in one corner a painted family, smiling with pride over what they'd built. Something in Sarah stirred, a recognition she couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way the painted woman's chin looked like Emma's. Maybe it was the idea that someone in her lineage had once built something so large it touched the sky. Maybe it was simply the miracle of waking up indoors without fear. Whatever it was, hope, small, fragile, unfamiliar, began to form. By midday, curiosity pushed them deeper into the brewery. Sunlight through broken panes revealed rusted copper kettles taller than any man, towering fermentation tanks, and silent conveyor belts that once carried bottles along humming assembly lines. The 2nd floor held brittle papers and overturned filing cabinets. The 3rd floor revealed long-forgotten locker rooms and a cafeteria frozen in time. But it was on the 4th floor that Sarah felt the past breathe. A portrait hung undisturbed on the wall. An older couple posed confidently in front of the bustling brewery. The man's posture was proud, but the woman's eyes felt alive, familiar, almost watching. Beneath them, a plaque confirmed what her heart already suspected. These were her ancestors, founders of the Hartman legacy. And then came the envelope, fresh, untouched by decades, sitting on a desk like someone had placed it there yesterday. Her name, written in the same frail handwriting Dorothy had used. Inside was a second letter, explaining that Sarah's great-grandmother had hidden something within the brewery during the Great Depression, something valuable enough to protect at all costs. The clue was cryptic but compelling. Look where beer was born, where simple things turned valuable, the fermentation room in the basement. Sarah stared at the words, her pulse quickening. That basement was flooded, a dark underworld she'd only glimpsed from the staircase. But now she had direction, purpose. The girls watched her with bright, frightened eyes as she folded the letter. "We'll need supplies," she told them, "and courage." In that moment, the condemned building no longer felt like ruins. It felt like a riddle waiting for its rightful heir. The basement was colder than anything Sarah had ever stepped into. Waist-deep water swallowed her flashlight beam, turning every movement into a blind search through freezing blackness. Machinery lurked beneath the surface like submerged skeletons. Pipes hummed faintly overhead, reminders of a time when the building was alive. After an hour of stumbling through the murk, numb and defeated, she realized she needed help, real help. And then, as if summoned by the building itself, a knock echoed through the brewery that night. A man in his 60s stood at the entrance, weathered and steady, carrying a diver's toolbox. "Dorothy sent me," he said quietly, before she passed. Sarah froze. Dorothy was gone. He nodded gently, explaining she had hired him, prepaid, for one purpose: help Sarah uncover whatever her great-grandmother left behind. His name was Frank, a retired commercial diver who had once worked in the brewery during college. He knew every inch of that basement, every corridor, every submerged room. With his equipment and expertise, the impossible suddenly felt reachable. That night, he mapped the entire basement, emerging soaked and exhausted, but smiling like a man who'd just shaken hands with the past. "Your great-grandmother built a sealed vault," he said. "Concrete airtight, 90 years old, and it's still dry inside." Sarah's breath caught. A vault meant intention, planning, secrets worth guarding, and tomorrow Frank said they would open it. For the first time since stepping into the abandoned brewery, Sarah allowed herself to believe that the letter's promise might be real. The next morning, Sarah and Frank descended into the basement with ropes, underwater lights, and a plan. The vault appeared through the murky water like something from another century, steel reinforced with brass, built with craftsmanship meant to defy time. Frank explained the locking mechanism. 2 wheels on opposite sides, meant to be turned in perfect synchronization, requiring 2 people who trusted each other. Sarah's arms strained as she fought rust that resisted every inch of movement. Frank coached her steadily through each coordinated turn until suddenly a deep mechanical thud echoed through the room. The vault door shifted, exhaling a breath of air sealed since the 1930s. Sarah covered her mouth as the smell of preserved fermentation drifted out, oddly warm, strangely familiar. Frank shined his light inside and froze. Gold bars, neatly stacked, glowed beneath the beam. Rows of bearer bonds in waterproof cases filled shelves from floor to ceiling. Rolls of preserved artwork lined the edges. Rare coins gleamed in glass containers. Stock certificates, some bearing names now synonymous with American industry, rested untouched for generations. And at the center sat a leather journal, tied with fading thread. Sarah opened it carefully. It was her great-grandmother's voice speaking across time, explaining how she had converted the family's wealth into tangible assets during the Depression, hiding them away so her descendants would never suffer what she had seen. Sarah's hands shook violently. Her entire life, every struggle, every night without enough food, every hour worked in exhaustion, collided with the truth before her. Her great-grandmother had left a lifeline across 90 years. And Sarah had been the one to find it. The appraisal took weeks, and each number felt more unreal than the last. More than 40 million in gold alone, millions in rare coins. Bearer bonds worth far beyond their printed values. But it was the stocks, her great-grandmother's deliberate, brilliant bets on companies that built America, that stunned even the experts. After nearly a century of splits, mergers, and growth, the value exceeded anything Sarah could comprehend. Over $300 million. News spread fast, bringing lawyers, distant relatives, and predatory offers. Cousins she'd never met appeared claiming rights. Strangers showed up at midnight pretending to offer security. But Sarah fought, with Mr. Chen at her side, Frank's crew guarding the brewery, and a determination sharpened by every hardship she had survived. When the judge finally ruled that everything found on her legally owned property belonged solely to her, Sarah felt something inside her settle. For the first time in her life, she wasn't at the mercy of the world. She had power, she had choice, but most importantly, she had purpose. She rented a modest apartment, gave her daughters their first real bedrooms, and began restoring the brewery brick by brick. Not into a business, but into something far greater. A community center, a foundation for families like hers, a place where people lost in the cracks could find solid ground again. It was expensive, exhausting, legally complex, but every dollar spent felt like honoring the woman who had buried a fortune so future generations could stand stronger. 10 years later, Sarah stood inside the fully restored Hartman Brewery, now a thriving foundation that had helped thousands of families rebuild from the ashes of their hardest moments. The triplets, tall, confident, compassionate, walked beside her, each carrying the strength that hardship had carved and hope had nurtured. In the preserved office where she'd once slept on a dusty floor, Sarah placed her own handwritten entry beside her great-grandmother's journal, adding her voice to the legacy of women who refused to break. She wrote about the responsibility of wealth, the weight of survival, and the miracle of impossible blessings arriving when the world had given her nothing. She wrote about choosing generosity over fear, rebuilding instead of retreating, and creating opportunities for people who felt invisible, because she once had. As she closed the journal case, Emma asked whether someone would someday discover their hidden message the way she had discovered Catherine S. Sarah smiled, touched her daughter's cheek, and whispered,